The Mediterranean. A sea of commerce, of culture, and of capture. For 3 centuries, its waters were haunted by sails of fear, corsairs from the Barbary Coast. This is the story of the Barbary slave trade. From the 1500s to the early 1800s, North African states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco, grew rich not just on trade, but on human lives. Raiding coastal towns, seizing ships, tearing people from their homes and taking prisoners. They fed a market of slavery that stretched from the palaces of Istanbul to the quays of Algiers. For centuries, European captives were taken during raids along the North African coast, with their plight often overlooked in historical narratives. This video sheds light on the lesser-known Barbary slave trade and its profound impact on European lives. The Barbary slave trade involved the capture and selling of European slaves at slave markets in the largely independent Ottoman Barbary states, North Africa. No coast was safe. Ireland, Italy, Spain, even far-away Iceland. Men, women, and children were dragged to slave markets, their fates divided, chained to the oars of galleys, sold into hard labor, or bound in the glittering harems of the elite. The Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean was the scene of intense piracy. As late as the 18th century, piracy continued to be a consistent threat to maritime traffic in the Aegean. Most of the captives were seamen and crews who were taken with their ships, but there were many fishermen and coastal villagers who were also captured. The majority of these captives were people from countries around the Mediterranean, especially from Italy. Captured men, women, and children were dragged to bustling slave markets. Some would be ransomed for a price. Many would never see their homes again. But this was not one-sided suffering. Africans, too, were enslaved by rival states. While the powers of Europe sometimes turned a blind eye, some paid tribute while others struck back with fire and cannon. Between the 16th century and the early 19th century, the Barbary slave trade in South and West Europe was one of 2 major slave routes for European slaves to the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East, the other being the contemporary Crimean slave trade in Eastern Europe. Britain and Ireland were attacked by the Barbary corsairs pirates primarily at sea but also by raids on land. The Irish Sea was infamous for being frequented by Barbary pirates, although vast majority captives from the British Isles were sailors and crews of ships around the Mediterranean. From 1620 to 1621, the government of James VI, the King of England and Ireland, engaged in long negotiations to prevent attacks, but did not succeed. In 1620s and 1640s, the coasts of Cornwall and Devon in England, as well as southern Ireland, subjected to raids by Barbary corsairs. Perhaps the most historically famous of the British and Irish slave raids was the sack of Baltimore. In 1631, the small Irish village of Baltimore was emptied in a single night. The raiders included Dutchmen, Algerians, and Ottoman Turks. The attack was led by a Dutch captain from Haarlem, Murad Reis the Younger, who had been enslaved by the Barbary pirates and set free following his conversion to Islam. His force was led to the village by an Irish Catholic fisherman of Old English descent named John Hackett, the captain of a fishing boat that had been captured shortly before the raid. They captured at least 107 villagers, some reports put the number as high as 237, mostly English settlers along with some local Irish people. The villagers were put in irons and taken to a life of slavery in Algiers. Denmark. Norway was also attacked by the Barbary corsairs both on sea and by slave raids. The Faroe Islands, which belonged to Denmark, were subjected to repeated slave raids by the Barbary corsairs in the 16th and 18th centuries. The most famous slave raid on the Faroe Islands was the slave raid of Suðuroy in the summer of 1629, in which 30 people were abducted to slavery, from which they never returned. The Danish-Algerian War from 1769 to 1772 between Denmark, Norway and the League of Algiers took place partially because of the Barbary piracy against Danish-Norwegian ships, whose crews were sold into slavery. Other countries affected were Portugal, Iceland, Italy, Malta, Netherlands, Spain, United States, and France. No slave raids were ever conducted by corsairs towards the coasts of Sweden and Finland. However, Swedish and Finnish ships were attacked by corsairs in the sea outside of Western Europe and in the Mediterranean. Italy, along with Spain, was one of the most seriously affected countries. Aside from attacks on Italian ships, many slave raids were conducted toward Italian coasts by the corsairs during the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the most famous of the slave raids against Italy was the attack by the fleet of Hayreddin Barbarossa on several towns in southern Italy, which resulted in devastation, economical losses and thousands of people murdered and enslaved. In 1544, Hayreddin Barbarossa captured Ischia, taking 4,000 prisoners in the process, and deported to slavery some 9,000 inhabitants of Lipari, almost the entire population. In 1551, Dragut, another slave trader, enslaved the entire population of the Maltese island Gozo, between 5,000 and 6,000, sending them to Libya. When pirates sacked the Este in southern Italy in 1554, they took an estimated 7,000 slaves. The next year, they sailed to Corsica and ransacked Bastia, taking 6,000 prisoners. 3 years later, Barbary corsairs captured the town of Cittadella, destroyed it, slaughtered the inhabitants, and carried off 3,000 survivors to Istanbul as slaves. The slave raids on Spain started in the early 16th century onward. The sack of Colera in Spain on the Mediterranean Sea occurred when the Ottoman general Dragut landed in Colera, Valencia with 300 men, and sacked the city, taking away goods and many inhabitants in slavery. He kept the captives in a cave before taking them to a slave market in Algiers. The slave raids grew particularly severe during the 17th century, when the corsairs abducted the population of entire villages along the Mediterranean coast of Spain, leaving large coastal areas depopulated. For example, in 1637, 315 women and children were captured from the town of Calpe. The Spanish crown was forced to raise the taxes of fish, meat, cattle and silk to finance the construction of fortresses to protect the coast and prevent people from leaving the areas for safer settlements in the interior of the country. Spanish ships were affected as well. In 1667, so many seamen had been abducted from the Basque provinces that those provinces could no longer fill the quotas of seamen to the Spanish marines. There were no Barbary land raids in British North America and the later United States. However, the Barbary pirates attacked American ships, took American captives and sold them as slaves. During the American Revolutionary War, the pirates attacked American ships. On December 20, 1777, Morocco's Sultan Mohammed III declared that merchant ships of the new American nation would be under the protection of the Sultanate. The Moroccan-American Treaty of Friendship stands as America's oldest unbroken friendship treaty with a foreign power. In 1787, Morocco became one of the first nations to recognize the United States of America. Starting in the 1780s, realizing that American vessels were no longer under the protection of the British Navy, the Barbary pirates had started seizing American ships in the Mediterranean. The U.S. had disbanded its Continental Navy and had no sea-going military force. Its government agreed in 1786 to pay tribute to stop the attacks. On March 20, 1794, at the urging of President George Washington, Congress voted to authorize the building of 6 heavy frigates and establish the United States Navy, in order to stop these attacks and demands for more and more money. By 1797, the United States had paid out $1.25 million, or a fifth of the government's annual budget, then in tribute. The Barbary attacks on American ships were a contributing cause of the Americans participating in the Barbary Wars. The Franco-Ottoman alliance, which lasted between 1536 and 1798, placed France in a different position than other European nations. This formally protected France more than other nations from attacks of the corsairs. In contrast to other European nations, France could complain over the corsairs to the Ottoman Sultan, who would be obligated to take action. In practice, however, the corsair states of North Africa were Ottoman in name only and did not necessarily respect the obligations of the Ottoman Sultan, who had weak control over the provinces, and France was subjected to their attacks despite the Franco-Ottoman alliance. Entire towns lived in dread. From Italy to Spain, from Greece to England, no coast was safe. Europe's response was complicated. Some nations struck deals, paying tribute to Barbary rulers in exchange for safe passage. Others launched punitive expeditions, burning ports and bombarding cities. Historians estimate that between 1 and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved along the Barbary Coast. Their fates varied, but none escaped hardship. The strongest were chained as galley slaves, rowing for hours, days and years, until their bodies broke. Others labored in fields and quarries, under the searing sun. Women and children were sold into households, or into the harems of rulers and merchants. Some endured brutal labor, poor living conditions, and religious persecution. Others found themselves in relatively less harsh circumstances, even serving in households or administrative roles. Public slaves belonged to the ruling pasha and were often housed in prisons like the bagnios. Others were privately owned and their treatment depended on their owners. While some captives were subjected to religious persecution, many white Christian slaves converted to Islam to potentially improve their situation, adopt North Africa as their home, and even escape the harsh realities of slavery. Slaves resisted their captivity in various ways, including escape attempts, theft, and passive resistance like feigning illness or slowing down work. European powers, families, and charitable organizations often worked to redeem slaves through ransoms or diplomatic efforts, though this process could be complex and costly. It's crucial to recognize that there was no single Barbary slave experience. A slave's fate depended on many factors, including social status, skills, age, gender, and the specific circumstances of their captivity. For the victims, life was defined by fear, of punishment, of disease, of being forgotten. By the early 19th century, the tide began to turn. The young United States fought the First and Second Barbary Wars, immortalized in the Marine Corps hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli." European navies grew stronger, no longer willing to pay tribute. Slowly, the age of the Barbary corsairs crumbled. But not before centuries of stolen lives had left their scars. In 1816, a massive Anglo-Dutch fleet shelled Algiers, demanding the release of slaves. By the 1830s, with France's conquest of Algiers and European domination of the Mediterranean, the Barbary slave trade finally came to an end. And then, silence. The Barbary slave trade faded into memory, overshadowed by the vast Atlantic system that enslaved millions of Africans across the ocean. But for those who were taken, for the Irish mothers of Baltimore, the Sicilian fishermen, the Spanish villagers, the Icelanders far from home, the story was never forgotten. The sea carries many stories. This one is a reminder that slavery wore many faces, that suffering crossed all borders, and that memory is the first step toward understanding. The Barbary corsairs are gone. Their ships are dust. But their shadows still drift upon these waters, waiting for us to remember. A story of fear and profit, of resilience and loss, carried on the tide of history. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more breathtaking history. Tell us in the comments, what topic should we explore next? Thank you for watching and see you next time.